everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 11th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. It's also move out day for me. I am leaving Florida and never coming back. I'm saying goodbye to this state, the state of injustice, because I have finished my doctoral internship, and I am, able to kind of take the long trek home. I'm going to be traveling quite a bit in the next several weeks. So I'm pre-recording quite a few of these intros for the episodes because I did not want to leave you all without content while I'm away. But I'll be doing some road tripping around the US and also traveling a bit in Europe. I'm very excited about this week's episode. So I want to just dive right into it. So I had the opportunity to sit down and have a chat with Chris Fabricant. He is the Innocence Project's director of strategic litigation. He's also one of the nation's leading experts on forensic sciences and the criminal justice system. You may have seen him in The Innocence Files, a documentary on Netflix. You may have read some of his public commentary. You may not have even known that you read it because he's written for so many different outlets. He used to work as a public defender and a clinical law professor, and he has a brand new book, a very, very important one. It's called Junk Science and the American Criminal Justice System. I know that this is right up our alley here on Talk Nerdy. So without any further ado, here he is, Chris Fabricant. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about your new book, Junk Science and the American Criminal Justice System. This is something that is really near and dear to my heart, both from a social justice perspective and, just like a human rights perspective, but also as somebody who really has dedicated most of my career to evidence-based practice and to, utilizing science as a tool and not misrepresenting it, not kind of going that pseudoscience route. So I'd love to just dive right in with you first and ask you a little bit about your background. So you are a lawyer, yes?
I'm a lawyer. I'm a second generation public defender, which is what I was doing before I came to the Innocence Project. I did, about a decade as a trial attorney, a public defender in the South Bronx at a place called the Bronx Defenders. And I was an appellate defender before that. And I was a clinical law professor for a few years. And then I was hired in 2012 to start the Innocence Project's strategic litigation department, which didn't exist before. And my primary role at the Innocence Project, apart from running strategic litigation, is addressing junk science and its use in criminal courts and its contributions to wrongful convictions.
Okay, so I want to get in a minute into the Innocence Project, what it is and what they do. But there's a couple things that you brought up that I think are just important to clarify. First and foremost, so a public defender, and I have listeners, most of my listenership is in the US, but I have listeners from kind of all over the world as well. And so a public defender, is that what we think of when we think of like a court-appointed lawyer?
Yeah, so there was a case called Gideon versus Wainwright in the United States Supreme Court that was decided 50 years ago that said that mandated for criminal defendants that were facing the prospect of prison time, so that means more than a year in jail, there was a constitutional right to free counsel. And, since that time, the notion of what a public defender is has evolved considerably from its nascent origins. But what it fundamentally means is that every buddy in the United States that's charged with a relatively serious crime is entitled to free counsel. And, as I said, that the role has evolved a lot because it used to be, largely made up of a pool of lawyers who were unable to get other work and weren't very client-centered and kind of were cogs in a machine that was kind of ratcheting up mass incarceration over the last, 40 years in the United States. Increasingly, with places like the Bronx Defenders, which I mentioned, it's just one of the most progressive and well-respected public defender shops in the country. And places like the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C., and several other leading public defender offices around the country became, adopted a client-centered, holistic approach to representing their clients and recognizing that, particularly for folks that are living in poverty, that struggles related to a criminal case are really multifaceted. They involve immigration issues, housing issues, childcare issues, and trying to better understand all of the factors that lead to somebody being involved in the criminal legal system in this country. So I'm a very proud public defender, and everybody who works in strategic litigation at the Innocence Project are former public defenders, and it's really the most important role, in my view, that a lawyer can play in our legal system in the United States.
It's interesting. A lot of things that, even in that short explanation, a lot of things come up for me as a sort of person who is curious about this world, as a person who maybe sort of prides herself on thinking a little bit more progressively about these issues, but who has never crossed paths in any sort of meaningful way with this world, that I am probably informed the same way that most Americans are, which is through like television and film, right? Through media representations of what we see. And I can't help but go to this place in my mind when I think of like bad representation of public defenders, which I think you gave us a very good explanation of why that probably was sort of the stereotype early on. To a sort of better representation. I keep going in my head to The Night Of. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I think it's a stunning miniseries that came out, I think, on HBO years ago. And Riz Ahmed plays a young man who is accused of a pretty grisly murder, and you don't know the whole time whether he did it or not. And John Turturro plays his public defender. And it's actually an indictment of the prison system as a whole, because it shows how this child, who's quite like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, changes while he's awaiting trial and actually starts using in the system. And he, by the time he's actually sitting for his trial, he's like covered in tattoos and he's like really hardened, and he's sort of like gotten all of these prison rules under his skin, and he's become a different human being.
He's surviving
because of prison. Yeah, he was surviving, exactly, and ultimately he suffered for it in a very deep way. And I think it's a beautiful example of that. But I also think they show John Turturro's character as a very complex character, because at sort of ostensibly he's overwhelmed, overworked, doesn't know what's going on with the case, but he really deeply cares, and you see him working tirelessly and thanklessly on this case. But at first, you can very easily have this conception that he's kind of like not invested, or that he's kind of like a moron, but that's not who his character is.
Yeah, I mean, we always used to say that there, and this would be of well-intentioned public defenders, that there were usually three types of motivations that one would have to become a public defender. There were the social worker types, and those are the people that are really invested with their clients, and that's really the whole focus of their work. They're the fuck the government types, and those are just like want to go to war with the man every day. And there's a great way to, have an outlet for that professionally in court every day. And then there's the trial jocks, and those are the people that like to do the in-court trial combat, and what they live for are jury trials or some combination of those. And so I have found with public defenders these days, that's usually fall into one of those, or again, those three categories. But there are a lot of, personal biographies, I think, that lead one to that work. For me, as I mentioned before, my father was a public defender, and actually that's how we met my mother. So my mother was indicted for drug trafficking in 1969, and my dad was assigned to her as her public defender. It feels
like an origin story.
Right?
Wow.
I mean, the marriage lasted about 20 minutes, but that's and any marriage that begins, a relationship that begins that way, is probably not ideal. But it does kind of speak to what is kind of core to my motivations in this work, and she was facing a life sentence, and under the Rockefeller drug laws, the notorious Rockefeller drug laws in New York. And also, as we've learned more and more over the last, particularly the last 5 years or so, of like the power of white privilege, is that, my mother is Mexican and Irish, but, certainly had white privilege. And although she ended up with a criminal record that was very debilitating and for a long time, but she was, as a white person, able to kind of dig her way out of the confines of a criminal record, unlike so many of my Black and brown clients whose, one ended up with a criminal record for something related to the drug war, really had their lives destroyed. So, I think that those types of, a background like mine is pretty common, for, in different ways for people who are, motivated to do the work.
I think you see it, my field in psychology, I think you see it, there's a lot of crossover. You see it with teaching. You see it with a lot of these types of jobs where there are individuals who are working to try to help. And very often they have a personal story, a personal narrative that brought them to that place because they themselves witnessed some sort of injustice or they witnessed some sort of systemic failure and they want to do better.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people go to law school with that in mind, and really what happens, somewhat tragically, is that law school is so expensive and you're burdened with such student debt that really it's, there's a certain amount of privilege to even being able to do public interest lawyering, because, you just don't make the money that you could. And, that's changing slowly. And one of the most outrageous things that we see in our justice system today, and I touch on this a little bit in the book, is that the pay disparity is, in many, many jurisdictions, prosecutors are simply just paid more than public defenders. And, how that is justified to me is just,
I know, it seems like the most fundamental part of equality here.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like you got to pay them the same at the very least.
And the prosecutors have a much easier job. It's a lot easier to get a conviction than it is to defend.
Well, and it must be just easier to navigate, like to get discovery, to just like to communicate and interface with people. I mean, very often it does feel like the prosecutors like work with the police, like that there's
absolutely.
like this kind of conspiracy to convict, even though we often talk about the framing of our justice system in this country as being, quote, innocent until proven guilty. And yes, I think there is an ethic to uphold that. Like ultimately, it does feel like it's very often guilty until proven innocent.
Well, and there's to give, and my friends and colleagues would be surprised to hear me say this, but to give prosecutors the benefit of the doubt on this, what I would say is that there's a moral and ethical obligation to have subjective belief in a person's guilt that you're prosecuting, right? Prosecutors must believe that. And so what you have is, once a prosecutor, really once a police officer that the prosecutor trusts and works with, regularly, when that's a real partnership, you think about Law and Order episodes, who's working together, the police and the prosecutors. And they're developing their theories, or the prosecutors adopting the detective's theories. And once that has been cemented into place, you have tunnel vision, and that extends throughout the criminal investigation. And really what happens is that the target is painted around a bullseye, the criminal defendant, and that works for forensic evidence, as we talked about, I'm sure we'll get into cognitive bias issues. And it relates to the way that eyewitnesses are asked to make identifications. And it's really what happens with criminal judges when they're making decisions about what type of evidence they're going to admit, often aren't really related to so much to the rules of evidence as they are to facilitating a criminal conviction. In other words, trial judges are often more concerned with the guilt or innocence and typically assume the guilt of criminal defendants and make rulings accordingly than they are to the strict letter of the law, and
right.
So this is
and it does it go both ways? Like you were saying that there is this sort of moral imperative that a prosecutor believe in the sort of guilt of the person that they're prosecuting in order to frame their arguments and in order to motivate the way that the trial moves forward. Does it go both ways? Do defense attorneys have almost like a moral obligation to believe in the innocence of their clients?
No, I don't think that they do. One of the things that's, important and clarifying about being a public defender is just how clear your ethical obligations are. There are fewer murky decisions to make because your only obligation is to your client and to make and advance the best arguments you can to defend your client. And so, most public defenders don't want to know and don't care about the guilt or innocence of their clients. And there's really not a lot of percentage in knowing that. Knowing that your client and how can everyone, really know is also an important thing to put out there. But is that knowing that your client is guilty or knowing that your client is innocent, either one is going to be somewhat debilitating, right? There's nothing more terrifying to going into trial with an innocent client, and there's nothing more
Right, because
heartbreaking,
then everything's on your shoulders.
right? And there's nothing more heartbreaking, and I talk about this also in the book, is having an innocent client that you're attempting to free and not being able to is, some of the most, devastating experiences that I have and my colleagues have at the Innocence Project, is knowing that somebody is going to die in prison that's innocent.
I'm curious, something that you mentioned really early on, that you were a public defender and you were also a clinical law professor. What is clinical law and how does that relate to the work that you do?
It's a really important aspect of our legal education system now that has really become much more robust in the last 20 or 30 years. And clinical law professors run legal clinics in law schools that, in addition to teaching or traditional courses typically, they have direct representation, almost always of indigent clients, and in a variety of fields. So I ran a criminal defense clinic, and we were taking actual cases in the South Bronx and defending individuals against misdemeanor charges. And then there are ones that are associated with housing and with public health benefits and environmental clinics and domestic violence clinics, and really, you name it in terms of poverty law. And it gives students an opportunity to do hands-on direct representation. And it's, more important than any other education that you get in law school, in my view, because it's actually teaching you how to become a lawyer and how to lawyer, which, there's old cliches about law school is that you really don't learn much about being a lawyer. What they say is, and, to a degree it's true, is that you're taught how to think like a lawyer. And this is why lawyers are so unpopular in dinner parties.
And I guess there's this cliche also that like lawyers are taught how to make money and they're not taught how to I guess forward their conscience, like to operate under an agenda of justice.
Yeah, and what making money, particularly, if you have an elite law degree, is not hard, right? You can join a white shoe law firm and you'll make lots of money. Doing well by doing good is much more difficult, and carving out a career that, if you're social justice oriented in law, is very, very challenging. And, some of the, and I work with a fair number of pro bono partners at the Innocence Project, and these are lawyers that are making, just gobs and gobs of money and, are having to represent companies and corporations and individuals that, they may find personally abhorrent, but there's really, nothing to do about that. And so the work that they do with me and with my colleagues at the Innocence Project is really, and I've been told this countless times, the most rewarding work of their professional lives. Right, because they're doing something that they believe in, and they're bringing individual justice. They're using these immense talents for good, rather than making money. So I'm not sure so much you learn how to make money in law school, is that the doors are open if you, have a certain, I'll use the disgusting phrase that you hear sometimes in big law. If you have the right pedigree, you can make that money.
Right.
It's just like, that's the reality.
It just breaks my heart that like you even had to specify, like, if you choose to be a social justice oriented lawyer, like, how is it that that's not the ethic of the whole profession? Like, I think about psychology, right? And it's true. I can, there are two poles in psychology. I can make very little money serving people who are falling through the cracks, or I can make lots of money serving the worried well. But I still fundamentally have an ethic to be progressive and social justice oriented. I can't legally be a psychologist and turn away an LGBTQ client because I disagree. I don't. But like I'm saying, if I were a psychologist who disagreed with their quote unquote lifestyle, I would not be able to keep my license. Like it's just the ethic of the profession is such that we're social justice oriented.
Well,
And
I would
shouldn't that
hate
be
to see
all of
that.
law?
Well, one, just as an aside, I would hate to see that argument in the Supreme Court, because I bet that this current court would,
I know, that's so
would
scary.
not allow that.
Well, that's why we're seeing all this weird stuff in Florida around like the AP psych class and basically the College Board saying we can't teach the class the way you're telling us you want. We can't take all that stuff out and it still be psychology. So sorry, Florida, you don't get our class.
It's in law, there are a lot of platitudes, and requirements that you do a certain amount of pro bono work, every year by some bars, so
there is some of that worked into the
yes,
ethic of
yes, but all that you have to do is look around, and you look at Trump's like army of attack dogs, and it's hard to imagine, that there's lots of righteous work coming out of those, the folks that are doing that particular job. But, I don't know that to be true for a fact, and everybody's entitled to representation. But, our, law is a very checkered field. There are many, far too many lawyers working, and there's not enough good work to go around. And there isn't, public interest jobs just aren't paid enough, and, as I said earlier, it's very, very challenging to make enough to really just to survive, particularly if you're living in a city like New York, where I live, where the cost of living is insane, and to try to make it on a public defender salary requires extreme commitment.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to dive into the Innocence Project, what it is, what you do. I also want to dive in, obviously, to this exploration of what is junk science, what is pseudoscience that's utilized in the sort of justice system, how is it misused and sort of twisted. But even before we do that, and I know that this is really cruel of me, but I want to talk a little bit bigger picture, like get out of the weeds and kind of take a drone view of the forest a little bit to talk about the state of our criminal justice system in America. And I'm mapping back in my mind to just the things that I've read, what I understand being somebody who does not work in this field, by people like Michelle Alexander, talking about the new Jim Crow, talking about privatization of our prison systems. Is it fair to almost say that there is a conspiracy? I hate that word. Or is it fair to say that there's a systemic failure that is not being fixed, wherein we are criminalizing poverty in our country, we are criminalizing racial diversity in this country, and there's a lot of reform that has to happen.
Mm-hmm. The criminal legal system is working exactly as it's designed to work. If it's as simple as that, and Michelle Alexander and many other scholars make the logical, critically examined, empirical point that there's a direct line from chattel slavery through Jim Crow to mass incarceration. Its chief purpose cannot be looked at as any other than a institution that is designed to exert social control over Black and brown people and poor people. There's, that is who's subjected to the criminal legal system. That's the people that are incarcerated in our prisons, which is 2.3 million people in various forms of incarceration in this country, by far the highest rate of incarceration in the civilized world. I don't even know what I mean by civilized. I just mean by in the world, in the
right, yeah, just in general,
right? Yes, and so I don't think that one can take any fair, objective look at our criminal legal system and conclude that otherwise. And if the secret to a safe and a low crime environment was locking everybody up, then we would have the safest, country in the world. And
Right.
plainly we don't, so even its, purported goals are plainly not being achieved by mass incarceration. So what other conclusions can be drawn?
And so if those are the purported or the ostensible goals, right, the talking points, the question would be, what is the underlying motivation? Is there a simple answer to this question? Like, why is our justice system the way it is? Why are there
Social
so many
control.
right?
Social
So like,
control of Black and brown people, really. It's as simple as that. You think about and this is something that I touch on in the update to my book, is, what we have is an emerging technologies on surveillance technologies that are being used that are supplanting some of the more traditional forensic techniques. And if you look at something like there's a program called ShotSpotter. It's alleged
I
to,
read about this a lot on
right?
like ProPublica and things like that. They're covering it
Right. So
quite a
this is
bit.
alleged to be able to detect and discriminate gunshots from other loud noises in neighborhoods, and then direct police resources to the sound of gunfire. So, like all junk science, that has a good curbside appeal, right? Makes lots of sense. The police should be where the gunshots are. But what they don't say is just how, all like almost like tobacco research, and that it's all self-funded, these claims, and that it's a human being that's actually making the judgment call at the end of what's supposed to be these, sophisticated algorithms. And there are many instances of these human beings changing, what their conclusions are based on prosecution theories. So that's the kind of the science behind it. But if you think about it in terms of what we're talking about in social control in these neighborhoods, is what it does is that it eliminates the fundamental Fourth Amendment rights to be free from illegal searches and seizures in entire neighborhoods, right? Because what these ShotSpotter programs provide is a pretext for police officers to stop everybody that moves in a neighborhood where a gunshot has allegedly been detected by this unreliable program. So, and effectively wipes out the Fourth Amendment rights of entire neighborhoods. And these are always, virtually always, Black and brown communities. So this is, a more of a symptom of the disease of what we've been talking about in terms of, what is the goal, and why are we policing and incarcerating the way that we are?
Right. This is just like a newer, higher tech stop and
Right.
frisk.
Yes. Garbage
Yeah.
in, garbage out.
Yeah. As we continue to talk about the garbage, I want to know, for those listening who have never heard of the Innocence Project, I think most people have probably heard of it tangentially, but maybe don't know what the Innocence Project is. Like, is this a nonprofit organization? Like, who is behind the Innocence Project?
Yeah. So the Innocence Project, just last year, so we celebrated our 30th anniversary. And I think a good way to kind of have an understanding as to what the Innocence Project is and what it is that we do is what the criminal legal system was like before the Innocence Project was established. And at that time, really, the criminal justice system in this country has been touted as, the best in the world, right? Still hear that quite a bit, right? And that we have, criminal defendants have more rights: the right to counsel, the right to confront witnesses, the right to silence, the Fifth Amendment rights, all of these rights, and that make wrongful conviction, a vanishingly rare occurrence, right? And that jury verdicts were thought to be largely infallible and almost always getting it right, and cross-examination being, the most effective tool for, getting to the truth, ground truth. And the what traditional forms of evidence like eyewitness identification and confessions and forensic sciences assured reliable verdicts. And with the advent of DNA technology, and it was unlike, almost all other forensics, it was developed first in a scientific laboratory for medical purposes. And so therefore underwent the rigors of the scientific method and was peer reviewed and subject to great scrutiny, and then went through a process of transferring this lab science into forensic science, which is vastly more complicated because you're talking about contamination at crime scenes and dirty mixtures of DNA, et cetera. But once that had happened. And forensic DNA analysis came online, kind of most famously with the O.J. Simpson trial, and Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, the founders of the Innocence Project, were part of O.J. Simpson's team in that case because they were, scientifically literate, which is very unusual for lawyers, and understood the power of DNA evidence, both to convict the guilty, but also, they believed correctly, to exonerate the innocent. And what was really important about when they founded the Innocence Project was what I think was one of the most important decisions, was the intake criteria for selecting cases. So, once Barry Scheck went on Phil Donahue and made this announcement in the 90s, and saying, we're launching this, write to us. If you have been wrongfully convicted, I write about this, the origin story in my book, and talks about how this tidal wave of letters came in that have never stopped coming into the Innocence Project since that time. And the intake criteria that was established was there was going to be no subjective judgments about guilt or innocence. In other words, they weren't going to be looking at the case file and saying, well, this person confessed, or that there were all these eyewitnesses, or there was this forensic evidence that pointed to guilt. The only criteria was going to be if biological evidence can be found and tested, would that prove innocence? And as a result, what we learned was that eyewitness misidentification is a leading cause of wrongful conviction, that forensic sciences have played a part in over half of all known wrongful convictions overturned through DNA evidence, that people falsely confess to crimes in great detail and apologize to victims and provide details that allegedly only the perpetrator could have known. Very, very compelling confessions of innocent people. And this upended everything that we understood about, the core planks of the foundations of so many convictions, and threatened the status quo in a way that no other empirical evidence of the unreliability of our jury system and 12% of our clients have pled guilty to crimes that they didn't commit. So not just our jury system, but our system of adjudicating criminal cases, period. And, since that time, we have also gained an understanding that wrongful convictions are not a rare occurrence, but occur with alarming frequency. And that, like everything else about the criminal legal system, it's disproportionate impact on Black and brown people. And so this is, since the time of the founding of the Innocence Project, there have now, over 60, perhaps in the neighborhood of 70 innocence projects that are part of an innocence network. They're all over the country. They're in Canada. There are a couple in South and Central America. They're in the UK. They're in Taiwan. I went on a lecture tour in China with innocence lawyers working to free the innocent in China. And what we see now is, what is referred to as the innocence movement. And, what we seek to do, in addition to freeing the innocent, is work on reforms to prevent wrongful convictions. And, which is really the end that I work on as much as any. And, there really isn't any more powerful argument than innocence in terms of reforming our legal system. And, racial justice arguments have outrageously and sadly not been very persuasive to mainstream and right-wing America in terms of legal and criminal law reform. What has been persuasive has been wrongful conviction, because almost everyone can agree that an innocent person shouldn't be in prison or executed. And I write about 4, what I argue are wrongful executions just in Texas, all based on junk science. And so as an important kind of centrist point that allows people who would otherwise not be persuaded by the stark racism underlying, everything that really has to do with our criminal legal system, as a different, though plainly related issue, to kind of open eyes and take a strong, hard look at what it is we're doing and why. And so that's the reason that for me, as where I had always thought that I would spend my entire career as a public defender, why I love my job and why I've really enjoyed working with the Innocence Project for as long as I have. Because, most lawyers who work in my field, there's a certain amount of despair after a while of representing individuals in case after case after case, and not seeing the kind of change that anybody who's done that work knows is screams out for.
Yeah, yeah, when it's so obvious, and I think that's the part that's like, this may be a really stupid, oversimplified, silly question, but I'm just so curious how much of this injustice, how much of these, like you talked about, these experiences that scream out for reform really come down to, at their fundamental level. Like we talked about, obviously, racism. We talked about this system of control, of maintaining power and control. How much of it just comes down to like hubris, just people not wanting to admit that they're wrong?
Oh my God. That's, I devote a chapter to the unindicted co-ejaculator theories that we get in post-conviction. And what that means is you would think that a prosecutor, a judge, an elected official, when presented with really clear exculpatory DNA evidence demonstrating innocence, would rush to the prison, unlock the prison door, apologize to the individual, write them a check to get them back on their feet. That just never happens. That is vanishingly rare occurrence.
Like you have to fight for every step.
Every step, right? And so what, the term unindicted co-ejaculator became, I have a colleague, Jackie McMurtry in Washington, who wrote a law review article with that title because it became such a common occurrence that it became kind of a morbid joke within the innocence movement. And, one of the stories that I include in the book was Anita Alvarez, who is the attorney general in Chicago or in Illinois, about one of these cases where there were, I think it was 3 or 4 young Black men that had falsely confessed to the rape and murder of this woman in a park in Chicago. And when they finally did DNA testing, that not only excluded all of the young men who had confessed to this, but also identified a serial rapist as the perpetrator. Instead of rushing to the prison and swinging open the prison doors and offering an apology, what she suggested in an interview was that it was an act of necrophilia. In other words, that these boys or these young men had murdered this woman, and then the serial rapist came by and violated the corpse.
Right, because that's a more parsimonious explanation to keep the cognitive dissonance at bay.
Exactly. So, and there's so many other motivations to not admitting mistakes. There are political considerations, there are lawsuits to avoid, there are elections to be won. And, there are some that are just, the more, one of the core stories of the 3 that I focus on, my client stories in my book. The last one is Eddie Lee Howard, who's a Black man who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death row in Mississippi for the rape and murder of an elderly white woman. And, there was never any evidence against him at all. And it was really just entirely made up. And you could see there that this wasn't some cognitive dissonance that was, that folks were attempting to avoid, or that there was some terrible mistake made and people were, unwilling to admit. It was just straight up racism about not caring if Eddie Lee Howard lived or died.
So this is like Emmett Till, except that instead of some rogue vigilantes, the state is the one who took him down.
And this is exactly what we were talking about earlier. The direct line from slavery to, and I write about this institution that he was at, which is, one of the most notorious prisons in Parchman Prison Farm, which was literally a slave plantation before it was a prison, and it is run exactly the same way. The distinctions are not, they're pretty subtle between, the way that it was run as a slavery plantation and the way it's run today. And that's also true with another one of my clients who's currently on death row in Louisiana, in Angola prison. And I write about this unbelievably stark when you go into that prison and you take this long drive to death row in Angola through the cotton fields where black men in chains are working the fields and white men with shotguns on horsebacks are guarding them.
Oh
It's
my
like, it's
God.
hard
It's like
to believe
it's
that
the
we've made any
KRS-One
progress.
song. Yeah, this is like overseer officer. Like, this is not new. We've known this.
Right.
Like,
And this is happening right now today.
yeah, it's heartbreaking. And it's I don't even know, obviously it's willful ignorance. There's always the people, I think, at the tippity top who are setting agendas and who are working really hard to ensure that change doesn't occur. But the conspiracy, I hate that I'm using that word because I'm, very anti-conspiracy theories, but like the vast conspiracy here is all of the people who have been duped into maintaining the status quo because they buy the line that they're sold. It's, I think there's some people who have power and then there are a lot of people who don't, but they don't want to shake the boat because they believe the rhetoric.
Yeah, that criminals should be punished and prison
Right.
should be harsh. And
Right. Law and
there's
order.
right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's like a core American value. Not one I share, but certainly it's one that you think about. It's only been the last 10 years or so that the criminal law reform was even something that any politician would run on whatsoever, right? It had been
Right. Before
before
it was
that,
all law and order. Yeah, that's what
right?
gets you elected.
Right, the right and the left were competing to who could be tougher on crime. And one of the worst pieces of legislation ever signed into law in the history of our country was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that Bill Clinton signed in
Yeah.
'97.
Thought you were going to go Clinton there.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, during that era,
Yeah.
and it contributed mightily to mass incarceration, so, and I think he was kind of, it was hard to call it a full-throated apology when Hillary Clinton was running for president, but there was some acknowledgement. It's like, hey, we made a mistake. It was like, that was a different era. And oops, sorry about the millions of people we've incarcerated.
Ugh. And obviously asking you, like, what is the solution? It's like, clearly we're doing this case by case. Like, that's the point of the Innocence Project. That's what we're trying to do.
Well,
But do you ever get
not just
cynical
case by
about
case.
this?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm a cynical
Okay.
person, right? Yeah, I'm a New York City lawyer. It's like
Right.
so I'll own that. I'm not so cynical that I don't have hope. And
Mhm.
the otherwise, it'd be hard to go to work every day. But we also have a robust policy department that seeks to make more systemic changes. And all the cases that we bring in strategic litigation are at least intended to have a broader implications for our system generally.
Right.
We
So setting
carefully,
precedents.
exactly. So we unlike public defenders, we're not taking every case that comes in the front door, and we don't take cases of people who write to us for help. We're seeking out important cases to litigate. So, and this is part of the job satisfaction I have, is trying to work towards greater reforms, and, one of the issues, for example, that we're working on, and this is one of the, drivers of mass incarceration and wrongful conviction, is something that's called the trial penalty. And what that means is that prior to trial, your criminal defendants are typically offered, vastly reduced sentences to what's possible, given all the mandatory minimums and the ratcheting up, during the whole tough on crime era that give prosecutors insane amounts of power, to sentence somebody after conviction. And you offer something that in contrast seems relatively light. I mean, they're not light sentences, but given the alternative.
So you're talking about
And,
plea bargains.
right. So this is, you get a plea bargain, you take a plea, and perversely, it often makes logical sense for an innocent person to plead guilty rather than risk trial. Because what happens if,
100%.
right, and after you lose your trial, this is what we call the trial penalty, then a case that, or crime or whatever that a prosecutor believes is, I'll use the term, worth a year or two, You go to trial, you get convicted, and suddenly you're looking at 20 years. Right. So how is that, not a fundamental denial of your constitutional right to a jury trial? And courts have held that not to be the case, and because our system relies on plea bargains. So we are working on trying to end the trial penalty with other organizations. And again, it's the innocence narrative that's really an important piece of this because, our clients, particularly those who've been threatened with the death penalty, we have so many clients who are innocent, have pled guilty to serious capital offenses to avoid death sentences. And this
Of
is, junk
course.
science plays a huge role in this too, because they're threatened with what prosecutors know is going to be unbelievably persuasive evidence, even against innocent people at trial.
And isn't it legal too? I mean, I could be wrong here because I don't know if it's legal for prosecutors, but at least for police during that original kind of interrogation when they're trying to get some sort of confession. Isn't it legal for them to pretend they have evidence that they don't have?
Yeah, this is, there's a lawyer in my department that only works on false confession cases. And one of the known drivers of false confessions is called the false evidence ploy. And what that has been shown in case after case and in social science research, probably Saul Kassem at John Jay is the leading figure in this field, although there are others, that has demonstrated that, and so much of false confessions are counterintuitive, because none of us have been in that room and
Right. So we're like, how could
understand the
anybody
pressure.
admit to something we didn't
Exactly.
do? Yeah.
But, and also, kind of paradoxically, is that innocent people are at the greater risk. Innocence is a risk to false confession because an innocent person that is being interrogated and by a police officer who believes in this person's guilt and is accusing, say, hey, we have DNA evidence that ties you to this crime, or we have all these witnesses, or we have this or that, when they don't, has no explanation for why this would be the case. And also, sadly, believes in the system. It's like, okay, I'll just tell this officer what they want to hear. Somehow they've got this evidence. I'll sign this paper so I can get out of here and my innocence will be established later. Right.
That's
and that's just
fascinating.
never
So
the
by
case.
virtue of being innocent, they are in some ways more vulnerable and easier to gaslight.
Right. And this has been going on, in one of the cases in my book, the Tommy Lee Walker case in Dallas, Texas, who's a young man who was wrongfully executed for the rape and murder of a white woman, falsely confessed in a tactic that the same tactics that we now understand today are so often lead to wrongful confession. And they used a polygraph machine to claim that he was lying during the interrogation, which is extremely coercive. We are attempting to do a posthumous exoneration and working with Professor Margaret Burnham at Northeastern Law School in Boston, to see if we can demonstrate Tommy Lee Walker was innocent on this. And this is something to, it's right at the edge. It was in the 1954 when this happened. And it speaks to the time where the criminal legal system was being harnessed to replace Jim Crow laws as the means of social control.
How many of these individuals are you working with that are rotting in prison from like the 50s and 60s?
Well, he was executed. So that's
okay. So this is just you're trying to prove it posthumously.
Yeah, and our oldest cases, I think it was there was somebody at the Innocence Network conference this year. I want to get the number right, but I think it was 52 years he was in prison.
Oh my God!
And that's just staggering.
It is. And I think about, I can't help but harp on this, but I think about the psychology of this experience of being an innocent person who then confesses, and this like horrible problem of like we talked about these plea bargains. There's so much that we can unpack here, but I think everybody can tap into that, even though it's so easy to go, I would never agree to something like, I know I wouldn't. Everybody can tap into that feeling when they're going through TSA and they're like, maybe I do have a bomb on me, or like they're going, they get pulled over by a cop and they start to feel guilty even though they didn't break any laws, and they start to freak out about what the cop's going to find, even though they know in their rational mind that there's nothing in their car that's findable. I think everybody has had that experience of like, maybe I did and I completely forgot.
Yeah, I mean, and there's, and the, one of the real problems with it, yeah, I'm just agreeing with you on that. And there's just one of the other ways that this becomes so pernicious is that in an unconscious way, police often feed innocent suspects details of the crime unconsciously that are regurgitated in these confessions, and they appear to be detailed information that only somebody who had committed this crime knew.
So then they're asking themselves, well, how did I possibly know this? I must have somehow done it and blocked it out.
Right. I mean, and, there's, a well-known case here in Marty Tankleff in New York, who is, confessed to killing his parents, and he hadn't done that, was led to believe that he had done this and must have blocked it out, and that was his parents, and so, yeah, and again, junk science plays its role here, because
hugely,
both in polygraphs and being able to, point to evidence that looks to be very reliable and it's not.
Yeah, I think when we first hear the term junk science, or at least in my mind, I often go to like blood spatter and fingerprints and bite marks and like the misuse of forensic science, or like hair analysis, things that are like more subjective. They seem very objective, but there's so much subjectivity to them and they can easily be misused. Sort of, I go to pseudoscience, right? Like things that have the sheen of science, but are not always reliable. But I do think that there is an important component to junk science that you are very good at pointing out, which has to do with like psychological manipulation and coercion.
Absolutely.
Like that too is junk science.
Absolutely. And there's so much of psychology that's misused, and criminal profiles are a good example that are widely accepted in the criminal legal system that are total junk and have no empirical basis for them at all, and are usually just basic logic that are being packaged as science. And we see, you raise subjectivity, and the way that I define junk science in the book, is subjective speculation masquerading as scientific evidence, right? And that there's no empirical basis for the expert opinion. It's based, almost entirely on training and experience, and often built on principles that are also lacking in any empirical basis. As you pointed out earlier, you are working in an evidence-based field now. Medicine, wasn't working in evidence-based medicine until really the 80s, right? And that's
Psychology was not evidence-based. It's still a huge portion of it's not evidence-based. Like there are still measures where you can literally show somebody some ink blots and then say, this is what your personality is based on how you replied to these ink blots. And there's a lot of contention within our field that should never be utilized to make life and death decisions about somebody.
All right. And we see that in capital sentencing all the time, future dangerousness, and these other, the techniques. Yeah. So all, science can be just misused, time and time again, and what's really, really frustrating with forensics, and the so-called harder sciences, is that, in virtually every field in science, the influence of bias is recognized and efforts are made to mitigate the influence. And, this wasn't even part of the discussion in forensics until the misidentification of Brandon Mayfield for the bombing the commuter train in Madrid, Spain in 2004. His fingerprints were matched to a plastic bag in which the blast caps were found in that in the wreckage of the train. This is a lawyer in Oregon, mild-mannered lawyer in Oregon, who'd never been even out of the country, had no record But he had been married to an Egyptian national. He converted to Islam. He had once represented somebody that had been convicted of providing material aid to a terrorist organization. And therefore, he fit the profile that the FBI believed, had committed this act of terrorism. So, what was astonishing about the case, and what should have changed everything about the field, is that Brandon Mayfield was insisting that, those can't be my fingerprints. And so the court, which is very unusual occurrence, appointed an independent expert to reevaluate the evidence. And that expert also concluded that it was Brandon Mayfield's fingerprint. And then Brandon Mayfield hired an expert, and his own expert concluded that it was his fingerprint. And it wasn't until the Spanish authorities identified an alternative suspect who was also said to, quote unquote, match the latent fingerprint, that the FBI admitted they were wrong. And,
so yeah, that just shows how deep that bias goes.
Right. And they all basically, the reason that the subsequent experts confirmed the first experts is because they knew what these first experts had concluded. And the confirmation bias was so strong because this is the FBI's elite latent fingerprint team that they expected to see a match. And that's exactly what they saw. And then Dr. E.T.L. Dror, a well-known neuroscientist who works in cognitive bias and forensics extensively, did a really clever study after that debacle. And he gathered a group of highly experienced, board-certified latent fingerprint experts and asked them to do evaluation on these cases. And what was clever is that what he didn't tell the participants in what they didn't know that they were even participating in a study, but he didn't tell them that this was their own prior casework that they had been given.
Yeah.
Right? And that the only thing that he changed was the contextual information that was included in the case file. Things like the suspect confessed, or there were eyewitnesses, or things that would have influenced the examiners one way or the other. And 3/5 of the participants, 3/5, changed their minds from their original conclusions based on nothing but totally irrelevant contextual information. 3/5. And this is fingerprints, which are thought to be much more reliable than something like bite mark evidence. So, one would think, if we care about objective, reliable evidence being used in our system, that all forensic techniques would do everything that they can to mitigate the influence of that type of bias. But that never happens.
And that your approach would be like almost the opposite. Like, I think that, and this is also a problem even in scientific communities, right? Like, scientists are also people and have deep, deep biases. But even when we're doing pure science, the ethic should be that you come to a conclusion and then you do everything you can to break it, to try and figure out how it's not going to hold. Yes, you want to try to falsify it. And then once you can't, then you say, oh my gosh, this is a pretty strong indicator. But it's almost like we're doing the opposite. We're only just trying to reinforce it all the time, and we're not looking for the holes.
You're painting the bullseye around the target, right?
Yeah,
Sharpshooter
fallacy, yeah,
right. And and this is, and I'm sure this is true in other fields of science, but much, I think, more so in forensics, is that people that work in forensic sciences, and these are not stupid people, and these are not ill-intended folks, right? Most of them are civic-minded, intelligent, and got into the field not to necessarily do science, but to work in law and order, right? And to solve crimes and bust bad guys, and have an exciting career that is working in, in one of the most popular fields in the world, right? This is why true crime is so, prevalent in media. And the problem with that, though, is that busting bad guys isn't a scientist's job, right? It's just deciding if the fingerprints match, right? That's the only decision to be made there, right? It's not, but the job is exceedingly boring if you don't know anything about the case, right? And so sometimes it just comes down to that, is that, if there is an examiner who knows nothing about anything, then it's a really dull job, and it's not why they got into the field.
How much do you think that a lot of these, I keep going like big picture. I keep wanting to look at the forest. And obviously when we're talking about junk science, we can spend time in the weeds, and I think it is, or in the trees. And I think that is important to do. But I sometimes wonder how much of this comes down to like and I don't want to call this a fundamental human bias because I don't think it is one. I think that it is a socially constructed bias, but the socially constructed bias of like just paranoia and fear that there are like criminals everywhere and that
Oh
like
yeah.
people just want to do bad and everybody's out to get you.
I mean, how many elections are swung, by
Right?
that? I mean, crime is always the top of the agenda. Fear mongering has been working, in politics for as long as anybody can remember. So
And it's
absolutely.
like culturally there could be, I mean, I know it sounds like a Pollyanna, like, pipe dream, but like culturally there could be a switch. There could be a movement towards a just like, why are we so paranoid as a people? Because doesn't that just cause more It's like all those dumb experiments when we talk about gun control, where it's like, well, just arm more people. It's like, no, then just more people
God.
die. Every time
Right.
more people die.
Right.
Like, that's
Let's
just, we
double
know
down on
that's what
this.
happens. Exactly.
Right.
Like, why
Like
are
mass
we so
incarceration is the same.
afraid? Yes. Why are we so
The
afraid that there are
easy,
bad people and that they need to be locked up, that there's like quote unquote evil in the world?
xenophobia, racism, the media, I mean, like these are the causes that leap to mind, I mean, is that.
Can I add religion to the list?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that kind of,
Yeah.
it is, I, it's, here in New York City, for example, I mean, like crime overall is down, and yet it is the number one issue. It appears to have led to the Republicans taking over Congress this last term because of Mayor Adams, firing up, the fear mongering around crime. And so, it's so pervasive, I mean, and it has, led the news for as long as, the news has been in existence. We talked earlier about the prevalence of true crime. And this is why I like sometimes joke that the reason I wrote my book was to create a new genre rather of untrue crime, right? Not true crime is this like, that let's like have some reality, and the people often who seem most worried about violent crime are those that are least likely to experience it, and most fearful of the immigrant next door, or the Black people moving into their community, or the broken windows policing being a attractive, regardless of whether or not it actually, and just for your listeners' sake, to those who aren't familiar, is the idea that aggressively enforcing things like disorderly conduct and littering and jaywalking and loud noises and that kind of
loitering.
thing.
How about loitering? Just
right.
existing, just like living
right,
outside.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Like aggressively enforcing those leads to overall reduction in crime rates. So, I mean, but regardless of whether or not that's true, that there are many who believe, I mean, if you live in a community like mine where all those things are going on all the time, I mean, there are lots of people who would like to see everybody arrested who's blasting their car radios or whatever, regardless of that. I mean, it's just like social control, social order being maintained by our criminal legal system. And you see
but
this.
like social order according to whom becomes the really important question,
exactly.
right?
And what's being enforced? I mean, you think about slavery and you think about Jim Crow laws. What was the system that was used to enforce that? It was our criminal legal system, right? That's always been true.
Yeah. I think about some of these fundamental biases, right? Like these biases towards order and control, these biases towards supremacy, whether it be male supremacy or white supremacy or heteronormativity. And I think about these very kind of human experiences, that really kind of underlie a lot of the, maybe not the original utilization of junk science, but definitely the kind of the perpetuation. Is that even the right term? I don't think so. And I think about two things that come up for me, and these are sort of little examples, but I'm curious what you think of them. So, well, the first one is a personal experience, and you're going to be mad at me because I was called for jury duty, and they ultimately booted me.
Did you try to get out of it?
I didn't try. I was very, very just honest. I was like, I am going to be who I am, and let's see what happens. And I was juror number 1 in a murder trial in Los Angeles. And I was there all day during voir dire. And they finally, at the end, and it was obviously the prosecutor that finally nixed me. But the question that they asked me was, do you believe that somebody suffering from mental illness can commit a crime? And I was like, of course they can, but ultimately I think it's important to note that people suffering from mental illness are significantly more likely to be victims of crimes. And they didn't like that answer, and they got rid of me. But
right, because you've expressed some, empathy or sympathy anyway, and understanding of, somebody suffering from mental illness. And it's also like, that's the wrong question. Or I mean,
of course it is.
right. It's
well, and I showed
clever.
them that I'm the bias that they want us to have. I
It's
didn't
fearing
have.
the mentally ill.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
That the mentally ill are by definition violent, and that they, because the guy who was on trial was, had a diagnosis. But the other thing that comes up for me, that was just like a weird aside, but the other thing that comes up for me is there was this study, and I find this study fucking fascinating, where they looked at a construct called the belief in pure evil, BPE. They kind of developed this construct, and they developed a measure to see how many people actually believe that there's such a thing as evil, like a legitimate thing, that evil exists in the world. And then they looked at all of these different views and how they relate to people's belief in pure evil. And people who believe in pure evil are more likely to want punitive reactions legally than to want to see rehabilitation, because they don't believe rehabilitation works.
That's
and that
so
scares
interesting.
the shit out of me.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. It is, and this is when I was a clinical law professor, one of the things that I really enjoyed exposing, largely middle-class privileged kids to when they were representing people and indigent people charged with crimes in the South Bronx, which is the poorest congressional district in the country, perhaps surprisingly. And what I would predict for them, and what you would see, is it's a radicalizing experience, because you see your clients as human beings, and you understand, the circumstances that led to this particular arrest. And, often they would say, well, this client, my person, this was fucked up. This isn't like evidence of a larger problem, but, this person, this individual, I can't believe this happened, and, that was a routine experience. And this is why, it should be mandatory for prosecutors to spend a year or two as a public defender. My sense would be that you would never become a prosecutor if that were the case. But putting that aside, is that what you see? And when I was, explaining to my own kids about the role as a public defender, because, they're American kids, right? They're exposed to our popular culture, and they, think that, guilty people should go to jail, and this kind of thing, is that of the literally thousands of people that I've represented over the course of, a 25-year career, that a tiny, tiny handful, 5-6 people come to mind, that were truly people that were going to have trouble living in our society peacefully. And that
they had severe psychopathy. They were
right.
just really fundamentally violent, and it was very, okay.
And so I'm not here to say that those folks don't exist. They do. But the overwhelming, that is a, minuscule, 0.1% of these people, and overwhelmingly, and this includes people charged with very serious crimes, have a story, and a compelling story, and a human story that got them to where, they met me, and we, in criminal court. And, it's such an important humanizing aspect of the work, and understanding of what we're doing in our criminal legal system, because the problems are so specific to poverty and racism that so many of the people that believe in evil and this or that, and heavy duty, law and order, just never experienced this, and all its many manifestations, and the trap of poverty, and the, and you can hear people that would be resistant to this is the pull yourself up from your bootstraps type of thing, and it's just that's just a fallacy.
They've had it their whole lives. It is a fallacy, but it's the American ethic, it's it's not like I don't blame them. I do blame them, but I see where people come from. I was raised Mormon. This is all I heard my entire upbringing, was like anybody can become anything. the playing field is 100% level. It's all about grit. This is manifest destiny. This is American exceptionalism. This is the dominant, again, kind of like supremacist narrative. Of course, there are people who believe this. They've been hoodwinked into thinking this from the time they were born by the institutions that they're raised in.
Right. This is why you have the fights around, public education that you have about what we're teaching our kids, right?
100%.
Right.
But the thing that scares me so much is this view that somehow that's like simpler and easier to believe, when I think it's actually pretty simple to understand that the reason people do things, and you can valence them if you want, good or bad, is because they are motivated. And usually the reason people quote unquote commit crimes is because they are desperate. There is something that brought them to that place. And to me, that's why I think the constructivist ethic matters. I think we should be teaching constructivism in schools. I didn't learn about constructivism until I was a PhD student. I didn't learn about this idea that even though there is objective truth out there, everybody's frame is built based on their own experiences, and they construct reality for themselves.
Yeah, anybody that's been in therapy understands that, or
Right.
if they did hard work in therapy, they do, it's like, how you approach, any of the stimulus that we're faced with in life is so kind of how it's framed, right? Like therapists, like best role in my life has been giving me new frames to think about the same memories and the same,
Right.
the experience of having in everyday life, and there are few people that have the inclination or time or money to, engage in that type of critical thinking about core beliefs. You turn on the TV, Facebook, whatever it is, you get, confirmation, feedback.
But the people who should be thinking about that are the lawyers and the judges and you know what I mean? Like, it does worry me a bit.
100%. And how politicized our criminal legal system speaks to that, right? There isn't really room for that type of conversation even, really.
Right.
It's like so much of this goes down. This was a murder, this case, this murder, this person did bad, and we're going to lock this person up. And and that's a satisfying conclusion for any individual crime victim or this particular case. It misses, the larger, societal issues.
And obviously you're dealing with these like pretty extreme cases where somebody is like, on death row and they, and there's evidence that could exonerate them. But even these, like, I don't know, we think of them as simpler, but maybe they're even more pernicious examples of like bail, just like bail in general. To me, that's just it's just anti-social justice. This idea that if somebody cannot afford to pay, they are given a tougher sentence. They're criminalized because of their poverty.
So the project that I was working on before I came to the Innocence Project when I was a clinical law professor was surrounded on mass misdemeanor arrests in the Bronx. And that was an innocence problem because what you would get is, and I actually write about this experience in my book, is my first arraignment shift at the Bronx Defenders. I represented something like 30, 35 people. And and I had been an appellate attorney before that, and guilt or innocence hadn't really been much of an issue that I had been focused on. But when I was working, I went to this first arraignment shift, and I remember making a joke to my supervisor at the time, something about, I don't remember how I raised innocence, is probably not going to be an issue or something like this. And the supervisor, her name was Lisa Hoyce, who's a dean at NYU Law School now, and one of the readers on my book, she said to me, she's like, "Chris, you're going to be surprised." And, I went to that arraignment shift, and I had at least 5 clients who had spent at least 24 hours, often 48 or 72 hours in jail for crimes that they had not committed, done nothing wrong whatsoever, had perhaps pissed off a police officer and that was it, or just got caught up
wrong
in
place, wrong time. Yeah.
And many of them, and I've written about this in my book and in law review articles, and this is the reason I was getting my students these cases, had to plead guilty to crimes that they did not commit because they'd already been in jail for, a day or two. They'd already potentially lost housing. They didn't know where their kids were. The devastating consequences, I write a lot about clients who've been in for decades, but being in for a couple of days can have fundamentally life altering consequences.
Yeah, you'll lose your job. You could lose your
Right.
kids. Like,
Lose your
yeah,
housing, right?
yeah,
And you would be compelled to plead guilty because they're offering you time served that you already have already served, and you can't make the bail that's likely to be set if you reject a plea. And so that happened all the time, regularly, every day. And that was so motivating to me in this way that, all of the issues that we were talking about are all motivating to me, you know what I mean? But that, it was just like, this is just a fundamental moral outrage, you know what I mean? And all of my clients were Black or brown, all of them were
yeah,
poor. And it was just
yeah.
like, it was just
And we can
sobering.
all also find that metaphor, that example of a time in our lives where we did something we didn't want to do because it seemed more convenient or because it saved us from headache or heartache later. I mean,
Oh my God, we all went to high school.
right, exactly. And I think about something, I haven't spoken about this publicly, and I'll keep it short because we're running low on time, but like, I think I was not talking about it publicly because of probably just fear. Really, that's all it is. So fuck it. I was recently on a trip with the university where I'm doing my internship, and on the flight home, or in a very bad experience in the airport on the way home, an international airport, one of the students on the trip, a male student, assaulted me, and it was rough. Like, it wasn't, and I hate that I minimize. I'm always like, well, he didn't punch me in the face and he didn't rape me, so like it wasn't that, but it was still fucking assault, and I got to stop doing that. And ultimately, when I brought this before the sort of, I guess they call it like code of conduct committee, whatever, the legal kind of stuff at the university, who I finally brought it before. They're like, did you file a police report? And I'm like, no, I didn't fucking file a police report. We were in a fucking 7-hour layover. We were exhausted. I was on an international airport. It's like, I could have, sure, but all of that burden would have been on me. And I was the victim.
So many
here.
disincentives to doing that.
Yeah, why would I do that? Like, I really thought about it. And then even just bringing all of this up, like the way that I was treated. And in this case, this is not even a perfect example because I was seen as the victim here. And the way that I was treated and the way that I was like, is this fucking worth it? Or do I just let this go? And ultimately, I couldn't because of my own ethic as a psychologist and my own concerns about this student ever being around other victims. But like, ultimately, I cannot imagine how fucking horrible it would be if somebody had thought I had actually broken the law, because the way they treated me as somebody who was victimized by somebody who broke the law was abhorrent.
No, I mean, it speaks to having a fundamental rethinking of the way that, we govern the behavior between individuals, in this country. I mean, I often say, that the criminal justice system, brings nothing but pain and suffering. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. You know what I mean? And that's what it does. You know what I mean? And there's nobody that is involved in a criminal case that leaves feeling happy and satisfied with
feeling like justice was done. Yeah.
And this is true with like clients who are acquitted or, clients who were exonerated. I mean, obviously my clients are happy to be out of prison and demonstrate amazing grace so often, which is just incredible to me. But that, why did this happen to begin with? And why isn't the person who prosecuted me wrongfully here apologizing? And the failure to apologize.
And how sad that's mostly what people want. It's like, I don't want anything
It's more
punitive.
Important than money. It's more important than anything, and that too has been surprising to me. I guess it shouldn't be, but how important the apology is, and I write about a scene in my book where Stephen Chaney, my client, who's kind of the backbone story, was my first client at the Innocence Project. And we were going into court and we weren't sure if it was going to be a contested hearing on this prosecutorial misconduct. This prosecutor who had wrongfully convicted my client, and he served 27 years in prison for a murder that he didn't commit. And he had engaged in, he'd used a bunch of junk science, and he had also done some underhanded stuff. And he was a religious person, and so was Mr. Chaney, my client. And he was going to deciding, he had to decide whether he was going to fight this hearing, deny that he'd engaged in prosecutorial misconduct, and potentially put a roadblock to the exoneration. And so he was, apparently wrestling with, what he was going to do. And he came to a decision. And I was in court, and we ended up, before we went into the hearing, in the judge's chambers. And the prosecutor and my client, Mr. Cheney, came face to face for the first time in 28 years and looked at each other. And I was standing there and next to my client, and no sounds were being made. The air just went out of the room. And Mr. Cheney came up to him and said, "I forgive you." And he put his arms on the prosecutor's shoulders, and the prosecutor apologized to him and put his arms on Mr. Cheney's shoulders, and they prayed together. And then he went out and apologized and admitted his innocence in court. And it was just the most unbelievable experience I've had as a lawyer. And the reason I wrote about it was because it was so unusual. Right. That just never happened. I mean? And that's why it's in the book. But it's like how healing that was for both of them was just, how it should be, and just almost never is.
Ugh. It's so beautiful, but it's also so heartbreaking to think, how powerful, like you said, it is, and how much more, how much more effective an apology can be, but also how rare it is. And again, that goes back to that hubris and that cover your ass mentality that so many people are taught. It's just heartbreaking. I could talk to you literally all day, and I've
enjoyed the conversation.
I'm just realizing that I've kept you for so freaking long. And so I do think that we have to wrap up our conversation, which makes me very sad. But before we do, I'm curious, Chris, is there anything, obviously there's probably a million things, but is there anything that sticks out to you about the book, about the stories, about the takeaways that we haven't touched on that you would be sort of like upset that we didn't end on?
One of the reasons that I wrote the book was try to change the media narrative around the infallibility of scientific evidence and our jury system. And what I hope at the very least that, readers of my book and listeners to your show take away is real just skepticism and critical thinking about why we're charging somebody with particular crimes and what type of evidence is, allegedly, so compelling. And, we need critical jurors, and, that goes to scientific evidence, but it also just goes to, the fundamental purpose for, why are we engaged in this process and what are we trying to accomplish with our criminal justice system?
Yeah. And I think that if there ever were an audience to receive that message, I'm hoping that my audience is that audience, because I think that ethic of critical thinking, of skepticism, and of reform, really, of knowing that the way to be better is to hold up a mirror and to admit mistakes and to do the hard work of improvement. I wish we could see more of that, but I'm glad that you are holding up that mirror for us, and I appreciate you sharing your stories and sharing your insights with us on the show today.
I appreciate you having me on. I again enjoyed the conversation.
Everybody, the book is Junk Science and the American Criminal Justice System by M. Chris. Is it Fabricant? Is that how you say it? All right. I nailed it.
I got a lot of shit about my last name.
I can imagine in this field. Yes. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being here. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.